Hello, my name is Ricardo Valdez, and today I will be presenting a new approach to drug abuse. The U.S. criminal justice system's current approach to drug abuse is ineffective because it has identified drug abuse as a crime. Like other forms of crime, drug abuse is currently being punished through lengthy prison sentences, fines, citations, and felony records. However, this approach has not led to any significant decrease in drug abuse in America. Instead, it has resulted in high recidivism rates for drug crime, overcrowded prison populations, with a large portion of this population being related to drug offenses, high costs to taxpayers, and incarceration rates that are racially biased. The best way to systematically deal with drug abuse is by expanding the use of drug courts while also decriminalizing marijuana to help reduce the stress associated with overcrowding. Historical context on the war on drugs. The war on drugs was first declared by President Nixon on June 1971. It refers to his decision to adopt a more aggressive approach to drug abuse in America. In his speech, he identified drug abuse as public enemy number one. He signed into law the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970 on October 27th. It introduced an increase in the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and no-knock warrants, while also repealing mandatory minimum prison sentences. It's important to note that mass incarceration did not occur with President Nixon's war on drugs. He brought an increased focus to drug abuse in America. He brought it to the limelight. However, it was with Reagan's presidency that we saw mass incarceration related to the war on drugs. During his presidency, he pushed U.S. Congress to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which allocated $1.7 billion towards the war on drugs and established a series of mandatory minimum prison sentences for various drug offenses. A mandatory minimum prison sentence basically means that if you are found with a certain amount of an illegal substance, you have to serve prison time. There is no discretion with this punishment. So the moral belief behind mandatory minimum prison sentences is that the crime is so heinous that you cannot rehabilitate the offender without first punishing them. You can start to see why something like this will not occur for drug addicts. You shouldn't send a drug addict to prison. In another context, for people who have sore throats, you don't send someone coughing to prison. You give them medicine for their sore throat. That is the proper way to solve a sore throat. The proper way to solve drug addiction would be to give these drug addicts treatment, not prison time. According to Britannica, the increased focus on drug crime during Reagan's presidency led to a massive increase in incarcerations for non-violent drug offenses. It went from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. So what ended up happening is that Nixon's increased attention and Reagan's increased punishments toward drug abuse led to this mass incarceration. Statistics and impacts on the war on drugs. According to Borden, Root, Goldman, and Smith, every 25 seconds, someone is arrested for drug possession. Another alarming statistic to consider is that the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 1/5 of the incarcerated population is serving time for a drug charge. While it doesn't sound very alarming by itself, once you consider the fact that the United States has the largest incarcerated population despite only being the third most populous country in the world, now you start to see that there is a problem with this incarceration. Another thing to consider is that this incarceration is racially biased. Blacks are 10 times more likely than whites to be in jail for simple drug possession. Statistically, this does not make any sense. This is not something that should naturally occur. Blacks, African Americans, they're a minority group. So how does it make sense that a minority group is in jail 10 times more likely than their white counterparts, the majority? So why does this occur? There is some historical context for these racial biases. According to one of Nixon's top aide, John Ehrlichman, the war on drugs allowed Nixon to disrupt and vilify communities that were against his campaign. Nixon knew that his opposition was the anti-war left and African Americans. He also knew that marijuana was popular amongst these groups. He strategically placed marijuana as a Schedule I drug temporarily. He had also appointed a commission to review this decision. They unanimously recommended that he reverse this decision, but he rejected all of the recommendations. With regards to Reagan's presidency, the mandatory minimum sentences that he introduced set up cocaine and crack in a 100-to-1 ratio despite triggering the same punishment. Cocaine is a luxury drug that is only really used amongst the rich groups in America, whereas crack is a very cheap drug that is popular amongst impoverished communities. So what ended up happening is that a lot of minority groups went to prison as a result of these mandatory minimum sentences. When asked why this ratio was set up this way, it was stated that it was done to target major drug traffickers within these impoverished areas. But when you look at who is going to jail, 73% of those related to the crack offenses were only had low level involvement in drug activity. They were just simple street drug dealers, couriers, and lookouts. They were not major drug traffickers. Those people were not going to jail as a result of this ratio. Statistically, when you look at these mandatory minimum sentences, after 4 years of being in effect, the difference between federal drug sentences for African Americans and whites went from plus 11% to plus 49%. Again, statistically, this does not make sense. If you consider things in terms of normal distribution, it doesn't make sense for a minority group to outnumber the majority group. Economically, the impact of the war on drugs has also been very detrimental. According to the Vera Institute of Justice, it costs $31,000 to incarcerate one person. Also, according to Bandari, 1.5 million people are arrested each year for nonviolent drug charges, with 88% of marijuana violations only being for simple possession. America would save $12.9 billion if marijuana was not included in the war on drugs. So not only are the incarceration rates brought by the war on drugs racially biased, the cost associated with funding this war on drugs is just astronomical. And once you consider how high recidivism is for drug crime, you start to wonder if this money is even worth it. The current penalties of drug crime. States do not penalize drug crime in a uniform manner. Punishments and the amount of substance required to trigger a punishment differ across all states. However, mandatory minimum sentencing is still required for all states. Some examples: Texas, it is a state felony, so 6 months to 2 years in prison for possession of less than 1 gram of cocaine, and a prison sentence of 2 to 20 years plus a fine for possession between 1 and 4 grams of cocaine. In Washington, 5 years in prison and/or a fine of up to $10,000 for possession of any amount of heroin, double penalties for subsequent offenses. In Florida, possession of most controlled substances specified by Florida law may be charged as a felony. Penalties include: first offense at least 1 year, second offense at least 5 years, third offense at least 30 years in prison and up to $250,000 in fines. The main theme is prison time. With deterrence theory, it is believed that harsh punishments will stop people from offending. However, this does not work when it comes to drug abuse. According to Spohn and Holleran, imprisonment has a more pronounced criminogenic effect on drug offenders. Criminogenic refers to the idea of something causing more criminal behavior to occur. So these punishments are actually causing nonviolent drug offenders to abuse drugs more frequently. You could start to see that if these punishments, 6 months to 2 years, and then 2 to 20 years, if that increases the chances for criminal activity, you can see how a drug addict can just be stuck in the system essentially. Another thing to consider is that these are all felony offenses. So even after a drug offender serves their time, they come out and they can't find a job because of their record. So they end up recidivating again, going back to prison, and you see how this vicious cycle just occurs. So now we look at a better alternative, drug courts. So what are drug courts? Drug courts are a judicially supervised court docket that provide the individual an opportunity to enter into long-term drug treatment and agree to court supervision rather than receiving a jail sentence. So why drug courts? Drug courts approach drug abuse as a disease. Their goal is to provide treatment, not punishment. This is a stark contrast to our current approach. Will they work? There is a good amount of evidence demonstrating that drug courts provide lower recidivism rates than traditional proceedings. If you consider recidivism rates as a way to determine whether a crime control method will work, then yes, drug courts will work. Spohn and a team of researchers conducted an evaluation on the Douglas County, Nebraska Drug Court and concluded that drug court participants have substantially lower rates of recidivism than traditionally adjudicated felony drug offenders. In another study that is not related to drug offenders, SID reviewed a group of offenders sentenced to prison and compared them to a group of offenders given suspended sentences and found that offenders given suspended sentences had a lower risk of reconviction than those given custodial sentences. Again, this study did not look at drug offenders, but when you take this finding and then compare it to Spohn's finding, you could see that there is good support to the idea that drug courts will work, that they will be effective towards reducing recidivism associated with drug crime. Economically, are they worth it? Research indicates yes. Carey and Finnegan conducted a study on the Multnomah County, Oregon Drug Court and found that that county was saving $1,442 per participant compared to traditional proceedings. In another study, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy conducted a long-term cost-benefit analysis of drug courts and found the savings of up to $12,000 a year for adult participants compared to the normal cost of incarceration. It's important to note that this long-term cost-benefit analysis assumed that the adult participant would not recidivate for 10 years after completing drug court. This is not a realistic assumption, but when you take this finding in combination with Carey and Finnegan's evaluation of a real drug court, you could see that there's a good chance that these savings will materialize. In another study which examined how California should reform their state-mandated treatment for drug abuse, Carey and a team of researchers recommended that drug courts should be used. They stated that drug courts show greater success at producing higher rates of treatment completion and lower recidivism, and were significantly lower per person taxpayer investment than state-mandated treatment. Drug courts were compared to state-mandated treatment, not traditional proceedings in this study. State-mandated treatment refers to the idea that a judge orders an individual to receive treatment instead of prison sentence. So while it's good that these individuals are not being sent to prison, one of the bad things about state-mandated treatment is that it is very expensive. But with drug courts, you see that you are getting your cake and eating it too. Not only are drug courts showing greater success at producing higher rates of completion and lower recidivism, they're also much cheaper than state-mandated treatment. In their closing statement, the researchers emphasized that other states should take into account the benefits demonstrated by the drug court model in their study. Drug courts are not perfect. Drug courts do not cure every single participant. They still show recidivism. In a study which sought to provide general estimates for recidivism rates in drug courts, Broman, Townsend, and Botti found that after 1 year, about 10% of individuals were recidivate, and after 2 years, 27.5% of individuals were recidivate. However, they stressed that drug courts should not be judged by their respective recidivism rate due to the complexity of this model. The main two reasons for high recidivism was area of location and the drug court size. With respects to location, what could be happening is that the drug court may be located in a very difficult area. So even though it's showing a high recidivism rate, it's still bringing a significant reduction to drug crime in that area. And with respects to drug court size, they found that drug court size negatively affected the quality of treatment provided. In an unrelated study, Brome and a team of researchers found that recidivism was directly associated with poorer during treatment ratings by probationers. Their study examined the relationship between probationers' ratings of treatment and recidivism in a group of probationers that were given 4 months of residential drug treatment. So while this study is dated, it is from 1996, it does show how important quality of treatment is. So if we want to provide good quality, drug courts have to be able to handle the population that they're treating. How do we avoid drug courts being overcrowded? The perfect solution would be just making a bunch of drug courts. However, this is not a realistic solution. You have to remember that the location has to be considered. What could happen if we just haphazardly make drug courts is that, okay, we'll have a bunch of drug courts, but the quality of treatment provided will still not be good. A more realistic solution to combat drug court size would be to decriminalize marijuana. Decriminalizing marijuana will provide many benefits. It will decrease the number of those charged with simple possession of a drug, aka those who are eligible for drug court. In 2011, marijuana accounted for more than half of drug arrests in America. So if we decriminalize marijuana, it will reduce the chance of these drug courts being overcrowded. So why should marijuana be decriminalized? When you look at the definition of a Schedule 1 drug, it does not fit the definition. Marijuana has a limited risk for abuse, established medical uses supported by empirical research, and is comparatively much safer than other substances on Schedules 1 through 5. So it does not make sense for marijuana to receive the same amount of attention as another drug on the schedule, such as heroin, Xanax, methamphetamine. We shouldn't be focusing on marijuana when we could be helping someone who is addicted to opioids. A popular argument for not decriminalizing marijuana is that it will increase crime. However, there is good indication that it will actually reduce some forms of crime. According to Liu and a group of researchers, they found that decriminalization of marijuana had minimal to no effect on major crimes in Colorado and Washington, states where they legalized marijuana. In states that had medical marijuana laws across the border of Mexico, they saw a decline in homicides and aggravated assaults. The study concluded that these medical marijuana laws were the source of this decline because it reduced the demand for marijuana to be illicitly smuggled across the Mexican border, reducing Mexican drug trafficking and Mexican gang activity around these areas. It's important to note that medical marijuana laws are not equal to decriminalization of marijuana. However, if we take these two studies to their findings Together, there's a good indication that crime will not be increased. There's a better probability that some forms of crimes will be decreased with decriminalization of marijuana. It will also save taxpayers money. America will save $12.9 billion if marijuana is decriminalized. It will have a positive effect on societal drug use. Bach Huber and a team of researchers found 25% decrease in opioid overdoses for states with medical marijuana laws. In another study, Livingston and a team of researchers saw a short-term reduction in opioid-related deaths in Colorado after legalizing marijuana. The CDC also found that opioid-related deaths in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado are below average, despite the fact that opioid deaths are currently trending upwards in America. So if the goal of our criminal justice system is to help solve drug abuse, it's clear that decriminalizing marijuana is an important step to take. Recommendations. It's recommended that marijuana be removed from the DEA drug scheduling. Marijuana does not fit the definition of a Schedule I drug. Furthermore, simple possession of marijuana should be decriminalized. Those who are found guilty of simple possession of an illegal substance should be placed in a drug court. There are two main ways for participants to enter drug court, either through deferred prosecution or post-adjudication. In deferred prosecution, the individual must plead guilty to the charge and will then be placed in drug court. In post-adjudication, the individual pleads guilty and has their sentence suspended while they attend drug court. In both of these methods, participants who successfully complete drug court will have their records expunged. Participants should be given one chance should they fail. If they fail, again, traditional proceedings may take place, but punishments should be light for these offenders, as it has been shown from numerous studies that lengthy prison sentences will not work. It is important to remember that these prison sentences have been shown to have a criminogenic effect on these offenders, meaning that it causes them to engage in criminal activity. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a great day.